Now, a little bit about what's actually happening here mechanistically. There's ample evidence from the psychological literature, beginning with the work of John Bowlby, who was actually the first evolutionary psychologist. He's the person who coined the term environment of evolutionary adaptedness. And what Bowlby studied was how children interact with their parents, especially in a situation when the parents leave. And he identified 3 attachment styles. The secure attachment style is a kid that easily explores their environment, checks back to see if mom is there, is not too concerned if she leaves, okay? Then there's 2 kinds of insecure attachment. There's the child that just clings to the parent and never lets them out of their sight, and therefore doesn't explore the environment very much. And there's the kind of kid that doesn't care whether their parent's there or not. It just doesn't attend to that. Basically, they've already fled and they're off on their own. That's the kind of kid that's just going to head out the door and not come back if you don't bring it back. And these attachment styles have lifelong consequences. So if you're insecurely attached as a child, then you're likely to have problems as an adult. That seems pathological. Why do these attachment styles exist if they're dysfunctional in adults? And the answer, very simple answer from an evolutionary perspective, they're functional in children. As that if you have a caregiving environment that's insecure, then a secure attachment style is not what you need. And so these children have adapted to their childhood environments, and that doesn't mean that they can change just like chameleons. Okay? And so these are long-term developmental effects of the degree of nurturance that you have as you grow up. Now, that doesn't mean that people have become totally inflexible, and we actually had a chance to test that because we've started to give these surveys now. We've been at this long enough so that we're giving the surveys longitudinally, and we now have a data set in which we've given the same survey to the same kids at 3-year intervals. And in that interval, about 20% of the kids changed locations in the city of Binghamton. And so they went from one neighborhood to another. And of course, on average, the prosociality, the quality of their neighborhood was not the same. And so then we can then ask the question, did their new neighborhood have an effect on the individual's prosociality? And the answer is it did. And so adolescents are capable of changing their prosociality in response to an environmental change. This is a natural experiment which enables us to say that. Now, in addition, we're able to demonstrate an instantaneous effect on prosociality, of the environment on prosociality. So in some respects, we are like chameleons, and we can instantaneously change our tendency to be cooperative based on our environment that we encounter. And so this study involved taking photographs of the neighborhoods of Binghamton and showing the photographs to college students who know very little about the city and asking them to rate the quality of the neighborhood on the basis of the photographs. And what this shows is a pretty good correlation between how the college students rate the neighborhoods and how the kids living in the neighborhoods rate their own neighborhoods. And so there's a lot of information in the visual aspect of a neighborhood which you can perceive based on a photograph that you've only watched for a few seconds. Then we did another experiment in which we showed college students the photographs of the neighborhood, and we said, now we're going to give you an opportunity to play an experimental economics game with somebody from that neighborhood. It's a prisoner's dilemma game in which you can cooperate or not cooperate. Okay, I think most of you probably know these experimental economics games. And this was not a fake experiment. We'd actually fixed it up so that the game did go through, and we matched the response of the college student with the response of the kids actually in the neighborhood, because we played the experimental game with the kids in the neighborhood, and the game did go through, and people were paid real money. And what this shows is a very tight correlation between the quality of the neighborhood, as estimated by the kids living in the neighborhood, and the proportion of college students who offered to cooperate in the experimental game with somebody from that neighborhood based on viewing a photograph. When we first got this data, I said, wow, this is so amazing. And then 5 minutes later, thought to myself, well, of course, this is obvious. I mean, if I were to place you in an environment in which you feel unsafe, what are you going to do? you're going to withdraw like a turtle into its shell. And of course you're not going to cooperate with somebody who approaches you. If you're in a neighborhood where you feel safe and secure, you're going to open up and you're going to be expansive, just like a chameleon. And so we have this 3 scales of response of prosociality. So what are some of the practical applications of this? How can we take this great basic scientific research and actually put it to use in the real world? This is an experiment not done by myself. It's done by Ernst Fehr and Simone Gachter, some of the most productive experimental economists. It's more experimental economics games. This is a cooperation game that's played by a group of people in which you're given some money and you can keep it, or you can put it into a central pot where it's multiplied and then distributed to everyone. And the best strategy is to keep your money and then to let others contribute to the pot, so there's a temptation to cheat. You play this game repeatedly with the same individuals, and what happens is people start out being moderately cooperative. Well, most people do, but there's always a few that want to game the system. And then when the others figure out that they're being ripped off, basically, the only way that they can protect themselves is by withholding their own cooperation. And so cooperation disappears in the course of the experiment like water draining out of a bathtub. Then you change the rules of the game so you can do 3 things with your money. You can keep it, you can put it in the central pot where it's multiplied, or you can put it into a second pot, which is the punishment pot, and every dollar you put in that pot gets tripled and gets $3 gets deducted from a cheater. And so what do you think happens? One of the messages of this experiment is the importance of individual differences. Everyone is not the same. Diversity. And so individuals differ in their propensity to be cooperative or not. They also differ in their propensity to punish or not. But a fraction of individuals love to punish. It gives them pleasure. You can put them in an fMRI machine, and their pleasure centers light up when they get a chance to punish somebody. It could even be something that takes place that has nothing to do with them. You could have A does something mean to B, and C really wants to punish A, even though there's no interaction whatsoever. And if there's enough enforcers in the group, then selfishness becomes an inferior option, and the group cooperation rises to a very high value. And so experimental economists know how to turn cooperation on and off in an afternoon based on these sort of experiments that are microcosms of human social interactions. This is a section of the city of Binghamton that we call the Valley of Distrust. This is based on a door-to-door survey in which we asked people, the adults in this case, how much do you trust your neighbor? And we see this amazing gradient in a very small section of the city where they trust their neighbor up here, they don't trust their neighbors down here. We ask, why is that the case? It has a lot to do with rental units. It has to do with absentee landlords, irresponsible tenants, and basically people that are not accountable for their actions, although that distrust gets generalized. And this gradient is very much like those 2 versions of the experiment. So we're starting now to do work in some of these neighborhoods and basically ask, what is it about the rental environment that's so pathological as far as social behavior is concerned? It's a small-scale society, and yet there's something about it in which is a breeding ground for irresponsible behavior. What can we do to hold people more accountable and to make it more like other small-scale societies which are able to police each other very well? There's also applications for education. This is a very well-validated practice called the good behavior game, and it's very convergent with these experimental economics experiments. And so this is a set of practices that you can implement in a classroom in elementary school, which establishes a culture of cooperation, respect, and good behavior. Again, I have to dash through much of this, but it begins by asking the children what counts as good and bad behavior. And even the kids that don't behave well know what counts as good and bad behavior. And the fact that it's now their decision and not somebody else's decision imposed upon them is very important. Then you divide the class into groups, and you have the groups to compete with each other to be good. as defined by the kids. And competing as a member of a group, earning points for your group, is more powerful than earning points as an individual. And so you play the game briefly, and then you stretch it out, and you have other bells and whistles. So this is this is in the Baltimore City School District, a very tough city school district. This is baseline data. These are the classroom from hell. 50 to 200 disruptions per hour. Nobody's learning anything. You play the game, everyone's competing to be good. Stop playing the game, misbehaviors drift up. You stretch out the game, you play it more often, you play it without being announced. You delay the reward, and so you get the reward at the end of the day, at the end of the week. And pretty soon this becomes the culture of the classroom. And it has astonishing lifelong benefits. That's why it's called a behavioral vaccine. These experiments were done 20 years ago. And now the people were followed, and they're now in their young adulthoods. They played the game in the first and second grade. That was the experimental manipulation. And we see these lifelong benefits, like putting money in a bank that earns compound interest. Okay, so now let me finish up by talking about how this can be scaled up to economic policy based on the Evolution Institute. And one of the things that we've done is we've collaborated with the National Evolutionary Synthesis Center, which is the National Science Foundation's largest evolution-related center, and we've really started to rethink economics from an evolutionary perspective. This has been an amazing experience for me, because when I started out, even though I'm a theoretical biologist, so I'm fully at home with analytical and computer simulation models, I've always been mystified by economics. And they're the ones with Nobel Prizes, right? So it seems like the economists are doing something comparable to the discovery of DNA. Why else would they get Nobel prizes? But now at the end of this process, I'm very confident about articulating evolution and economics as different paradigms, and some sense in which economic theory, current economic theory, is profoundly wrong, and how evolution applied to human behavior can actually, despite being highly provisional, it's not as if we have all the answers by any means, but provides a toolkit for finding the answers, which is actually the best toolkit around. And so I've written about this on my blog. Encourage you to read that. And I want to focus on one person, Elinor Ostrom, who became famous last year for being the first woman to win the Nobel Prize in economics. But that's not what was important. What was important is what her work stands for. She began as a political scientist, but now it's become broader and is very much part of the multidisciplinary evolutionary community. And so here's what Ostrom did to win the Nobel Prize. It has much to do with the tragedy of the commons, this same problem of altruism and prosociality and for the good of the group, and the vulnerability of these things for selfish options that we've been talking about all this time. And so the received economic wisdom is that when people are drawing upon a common resource, the tragedy of overuse is inevitable. And the only two solutions are to privatize the resource so that you divide it up, everyone gets their own chunk, and they manage that because it's theirs. That's not something that you can do for all resources. Or to regulate it from above. And what Ostrom showed, not just theoretically, but with an extensive worldwide database on groups of all sorts, modern and traditional, that are attempting to manage their commons, is that they're capable of doing so, thank you very much, sometimes for centuries. Groups of people are capable of managing their commons, but only if certain design features are present. And these design features are highly convergent, highly conciliant, to use a term of my namesake, E.O. Wilson, with the principles that we've been talking about for the evolution of cooperation, genetically or culturally And so now I'm pleased to give you Lynn Ostrom's recipe for success. Lynn Ostrom has a passing resemblance to Julia Childs here, and isn't that how we want our Nobel laureates to look? So friendly compared to the austere edifice of neoclassical economics. So now I'm going to give you the design features that enable groups to function as adaptive units. There's 7 of them. 1, clearly defined boundaries. It's very important for the group to know what it is as a group, to have an identity and know that its resources are its own, clearly delineated. 2, proportional equivalence between benefits and costs. What this means is that it's not going to be sustainable, to use a term that I've learned was popularized by Charles Birch. It's not going to be sustainable if some people are sustaining all the costs and some people are getting all the benefits. That's extreme altruism. Much better for those who have the costs to also get proportional benefits. And a very important book by Richard Wilkinson and Kate Pickett called The Spirit Level extensively documents the corrosive effects of inequality on both an international scale and on a scale of comparison of states within the United States. There's lots of measures of income disparity and other forms of inequality, and its toxic effects on just about everything that you might want to have in society. And so the idea that egalitarianism is very important based on this principle at all scales. Collective choice arrangements. Everyone from a first grader on up hates to be bossed around. And so if I tell you what to do, you're going to resent it. But if you decide what to do in the company of others, then that can be very powerful, and that you'll be very likely to work hard on behalf of a decision that we made, not that you made, and that I have to follow. And so consensus decision-making is very important. Monitoring. The good news is, unlike what economists think, not everyone is selfish. Large fraction of people happy to cooperate, happy to be solid citizens. The bad news is that about 10 or 15% of the people are just like economists, think that all people are. And so, and someone's going to try to game the system. And unless you monitor, have a capacity to monitor and detect people that are trying to game the system, then you can just forget about it. And so monitoring is essential. How you monitor, there's lots of different possibilities, but you've got to monitor. And once somebody transgresses, there have to be sanctions, and those sanctions have to be graduated. Start out mild. Don't bring the hammer down right away. In small-scale societies, such as hunter-gatherer societies, the first line of defense is gossip. So if somebody misbehaves, you just start talking about it. And that's typically enough because people are passionate about their reputation. That's what makes human society so cooperative, is that an individual's welfare is so much in the hands of the other individuals in their group, so that the rest of the group merely has to decide if they want you to go, and in many cases, you just have to go. It's that cheap in order to exert social control, both positive or negative. In a case like that, then the cost of sanctions is very low. Often just talk is good enough. But of course there will be situations in which it is going to escalate, and that you have to be prepared to escalate for the individual that is truly intransigent, basically, and is incorrigible. And by the way, religions typically score very high in all of these respects. This is one reason why I think I'm right up there with Charles Birch in loving to study religion, because religions are so good. A good religion is so good at creating community. And so we have so much to learn from religions in their capacity to do that, even if we're not religious. And I'm not religious. I'm 100% atheist. But still, I love studying religions, and I love interacting with religious folks to the extent that we have the common goal of forming a community. conflict resolution mechanisms. If there's a conflict of interest, it has to be resolved quickly and fairly, typically involving respected people in the group. It can't fester. It can't wait for years in court and things like that. This is very important, that in order for this to happen, a group must have autonomy. Just like those liberals, it has to have elbow room. And so in a modern social context, if a neighborhood or any group basically is not allowed to make its decisions, then none of this can happen. And so local autonomy is extremely important. There's a Catholic principle of subsidiarity, which basically articulates this principle. The principle of subsidiarity is that the local groups can do it however they want, and the church will not interfere unless a problem surfaces. And I think that principle needs to be extended to other aspects of society. And then finally, in a large-scale society, there's going to be groups of groups, and the relationships among the groups have to embody the same principles as the relationships within groups. And so this leads to a very important concept, and so biological, is that just like an organism, a large organism, has to be a multicellular organism, a large cooperative society needs to be a multicellular society. It cannot be the case if just individuals interact anonymously in a big society. It needs to be the case that individuals interact in groups, small groups, because that is the ancestral human environment. That's the environment in which we thrive, basically. And so the concept of a multicellular society is absolutely key. So this recipe can be applied to any situation that requires a collective action. All the details can be different, so there's a lot of diversity, but these design features can apply everything from a single city block, we're putting them to use in our community-based research, all the way up to the world economy. So to summarize, seems grandiose to say that this is an important moment in intellectual history, but I think that is absolutely defensible. That the 20th century was a period of integration for the biological sciences, and that the 21st century will see comparable integration for all knowledge of humanity. There's no other contender in the biological sciences than other evolutionary theory. And so this is happening very fast at the level of research and scholarship, more slowly with respect to higher education, public policy, and the general public. And so we have a need for catalytic action. And thank you very much.
Thank you for a very interesting talk. One of the points on the last few slides about the success was that gossiping can be a good thing. Gossiping.
Yeah.
I suppose I have to take it with a pinch of salt, in that many times gossip is based on half-truths, or sometimes even fabricated things, and it has many times brought down very decent and honest people as well. Like, for example, there is a gossip, Obama is a Muslim. Yeah? I mean, that's no good. So I assume what it means is that do it, but do it based on facts.
Well, that's a very good point. Gossip turns out to be a fascinating thing to study. One of these things which has been not been very seriously studied, but needs to be and is starting to be studied from an evolutionary perspective. So I have some papers on this. And when you look empirically at how gossip takes place in a small-scale society, what you find out is that it's very highly moralistic. And there's two kinds of gossip. There's gossiping for self-serving purposes, and then there's gossiping basically on behalf of the group. And the moral norms are such is that gossiping for self-serving purposes is something that you're really not supposed to do. And typically this regulates itself pretty well in a small-scale society, but that's not necessarily the case in a large-scale society. And so I'd like to use this opportunity to introduce a concept which was not part of my lecture. That is the concept of mismatch, evolutionary mismatch, that anything that evolves, whether by genetic or cultural evolution, is only adaptive against the context of the environment in which it evolved. That's the environment of evolutionary adaptedness. And if you put it in a different environment, then all bets are off. And so I think some of the manifestations of gossip, which are, as you say, destructive, are often taking place in a larger context in which it's not being regulated as it should. It's the cultural equivalent of immune system dysfunction. We know that there's immune system diseases, which is basically the immune system malfunctioning, and it's a form of friendly fire. I think that is also the case with various forms of gossip, and why, for example, gossip is exploited commercially. If you look at all the tabloids, all that stuff about the celebrities, we just can't get enough of it because we have this hunger for this kind of social information, and that can be exploited by consumerism.
We are now rapidly approaching the situation where we have evolved into a species which is hell-bent on self-destruction. So there seems to me to be a split between the sort of deliberate planning for the betterment of human society that you're talking about and what I understand from more orthodox Darwin theory of evolution, where somehow or other selection is supposed to ensure the survival of the species. And this is no longer obviously happening.
Well, a lot of food for thought there, and let me just make a few points about that. One is the concept of niche construction is a hot topic in ecology and evolution, and basically what that does, as you probably know, is it takes note of the fact that organisms change their environment, and then that, of course, feeds back to their own evolution. And niche construction exists in biological evolution, but it exists with a vengeance in human evolution, where there's so much feedback between our impact of the environment and then feeding back on our adaptations. Another very important point to make is that evolution doesn't make everything nice. And very typically, despite the fact that group selection can occur and that it can cause groups to function adaptively, very often it does not occur. And so what evolves is good for me, not us. What also evolves is good for me tomorrow, but not good for me next year. And so evolution is often selfish and short-sighted. Even when evolution evolves for the good of the group, the best that it can do is to turn the group into a superorganism. We know what organisms do to each other. And so that's what superorganisms do to each other. So group selection doesn't get rid of conflict. It elevates conflict to a level where it can take place with even more destructive force than before. And so actually, the situation that you described, which results in maladaptation and collapse and all of these things, that's actual orthodoxy. That's taking the message seriously that evolution explains the good, the bad, the beautiful, and the ugly in nature and in human evolution. And so what that means is that if we want to basically to engineer good outcomes, we have to understand the evolutionary process well enough so that we can manage it. Because left unmanaged, evolution will take us where we don't want to go. So this is a matter of becoming wise managers of evolutionary processes.
You mentioned individual differences in the way that people behave cooperatively and otherwise. And you talked about a lot of the environmental and cultural influences that can account for that kind of variability. I wonder what you think in terms of the genetic component of variability. And there has been some interesting research, Jonathan Haidt amongst others, looking at some of these liberal conservative things as one potential axis of variability.
Right.
But to what degree do you think there might be some genetic predispositions, and to what extent can evolution account for that that kind of ecology?
Yeah, another great question, and the answer is all of the above. That when you look at individual differences at the phenotypic level, and then you ask about the causes will include genetic polymorphisms in addition to mechanisms of phenotypic plasticity. Do you know that this is even true for beehives? And it's fascinating that if you look at bee colonies, the individual workers have the ability to do all the different tasks of the hive, But it is still the case that it's important for a beehive to be genetically diverse, not just to defend itself against a disease organism, but there's something about genetic differences in predispositions which makes the colony function better. And so there is just a ton of fascinating information on genetic polymorphisms, especially in neurochemicals. This is one of the things that we study in the city of Binghamton. We study genetic polymorphisms and dopamine and serotonin genes and so on and so forth. And it does make a difference, but that difference often takes the form of very complex gene-environment interactions. And so often it's hard to detect in terms of main effects. So that if you look at, for example, the two homozygotes on the DRD4 locus, then it's having a big effect in how they interact with the environment. But there's such a range of outcomes that you have to be really smart about looking at all those interactions. So we have to take note of genetic differences not only within populations but between populations. There's a book called The 10,000-Year Explosion, which basically makes the point. This is a very important result from biological evolution. Rick Schein does some of the best work on this anywhere. Evolution takes place on ecological timescales. The forces of natural selection can be so strong that in a single generation you can get meaningful evolutionary change. And it turns out that that is just as true for our species as it is for other species, maybe even more so. And so the idea that genetic evolution stands still during the timescales that matter for humans, it's just not true.
Thank you very much for a great lecture. I'd just like to take you back to your comments on the rapidity of evolutionary change. The anvil on which that change occurs are differences in mortality and fertility among humans. And I've always conceived that as an incredibly slow process. How do you conceive of that rapidity, given that that's still true, that fertility and mortality differentials are the way that these things get, the way it works?
There's very well documented cases, and Rick, you might be able to give a better answer than I. But if you take, for example, the case of lactose tolerance in cultures that started to do dairying practices, so now that there was a resource for adults, but adult mammals can't digest lactose, that ability shuts off basically after weaning, and so there was a genetic mutation that sort of turns it on in adults. And it's spread in those populations, not others. So geographically, there's huge differences in lactose tolerance genes. Your ability to drink milk depends very much on where your ancestors came from, and it evolved in a few thousand years. And so what that means is that those who had the ability, that provided a sufficient selection advantage, so that the rate of evolution was high enough in that case. And there's some pretty compelling evidence is that the same is true of psychological traits. If you look at SNPs, single nucleotide polymorphisms that affect sort of psychoactive functions, those are more variable worldwide than any other category of traits. So the anvil, as you nicely put it, is sufficiently strong that it can take place in that time scale.
I was just wondering, your work and Dr. Ostrom's seems to suggest from a governmental standpoint that perhaps a more laissez-faire, libertarian, local community-oriented approach would be most effective. But I was wondering if you had any thoughts about, from a sort of superorganism kind of level, given that people don't like to be told what to do, how we might happily reconcile these ideas with sometimes the moral imperative to advance issues that are unpopular, say pertaining to discrimination or civil rights issues or that kind of thing, from a public policy perspective.
Right. So another great question. One of the installments on my blog is about Lynn Ostrom is called An Intriguing Blend of Liberal and Conservative Principles. And so that principle number 6 is local autonomy. That sounds libertarian. Basically, groups should have the authority to do things their way. That's very important. But on the other hand, it's groups that need autonomy, not individuals. Within the group, it's all about regulation. And so that's a liberal principle. And so I think that there's a kind of a middle way, basically. It's hard to classify this in terms of the typical political dichotomies. So I think that that's encouraging. I don't want to underestimate some of these, in fact, many of these problems. But I think that it's nice that it doesn't fit easily into either camp. And so there might be some middle ground that people can agree upon.
Hi, I'm a mathematician, and sorry to bore you with a personal problem, but I often use the fact that there are so many people that claim they can't do mathematics, and that in fact from an evolutionary perspective that seems bizarre that such a small proportion of the population would be able to have this skill. But you're kind of suggesting now that maybe I'm wrong when I talk about this, and that in fact it could be quite possible for a select group of people to evolve to do something completely different and be quite happy within society. Is that right?
Oh, so many interesting things about that. This actually came up in one of our foci on childhood education. And so there's a couple of plausible hypotheses which need to be discriminated. So the verdict is still out. Someone named David Geary, who very much studies mathematical aptitude in education, his idea, which is perfectly plausible, is that something like math is so newfangled that it will always be difficult to learn. We're programmed to walk. We love to learn how to hunt. Social skills, we just have an appetite for it because these are the things that are, that we've always learned to do. But newfangled things, such as reading and mathematics, we're just not built for it. It's like getting a bear to ride a bicycle. Okay, and so it'll always be hard. It'll always require drill and things like that. As to genetic polymorphisms, perhaps. So that's one school of thought. Another school of thought is that if you look, is in the first place, all cultures have a whole bunch to teach and learn. And a hunter-gatherer culture has a tremendous lore of knowledge, and often very complicated knowledge, that must be learned and taught. So education has to take place in all cultures. But if you look at how it happens in most traditional cultures, and especially in hunter-gatherer cultures, there's very little that resembles formal instruction. What happens is the kids run around in mixed age groups, and the older kids really want to be adults because it's the only game in town, and the younger kids really want to be like older kids. And the whole goddamn thing just runs itself on the basis of motivated play and practice. And so another possibility is that if you could create this kind of educational environment, and if in fact the older kids were reading things and perhaps doing mathematics and so on, so that there was a strong reason to do it, as opposed to it being marginalized in the culture, then people would acquire that knowledge as easily as they acquire other skills such as tracking or learning your song lines or something like that. And there's some actual examples of this happening. So it's need-based, and when people have the need, they simply do it. That is one of the possibilities, one that I certainly favor because it leads to a very interesting new form of education.